"We do not need your license anymore," Preston laughed, his voice echoing in the polished boardroom of Garrison Global Logistics. The younger man leaned back in his leather chair, a smug smile playing on his face, oblivious to the storm he was about to unleash. In his mind, he had just solved a major financial puzzle by cutting my compliance department, but he had no idea that he had just pulled the pin on a regulatory grenade. To understand how a 31-year-old vice president of operations managed to freeze 3,200 containers of time-sensitive cargo at the port of Long Beach, you have to go back to the year 2006. That was the year I joined what was then a modest, mid-sized freight forwarder known as Garrison Global Logistics. Back in those early days, the company was a simple operation with only 20 trucks and a small leased warehouse near the docks. The founder, Walter Garrison, was a practical man who understood that in the international shipping business, your word is your currency, and your paperwork is your shield against the federal government. Walter hired me as his director of customs compliance because the company was racking up thousands of dollars in penalties due to sloppy filings. As a licensed customs broker, I possessed a credential that required passing a grueling 4-hour examination covering thousands of pages of tariff schedules, customs regulations, and federal statutes. The examination is notoriously difficult, with a pass rate that regularly hovers below 15%, requiring a deep, analytical understanding of administrative law. My office was always filled with massive, leather-bound binders of the harmonized tariff schedule of the United States, along with stack after stack of federal directives. Over the next 2 decades, I built the compliance department from the ground up, establishing a flawless record with United States Customs and Border Protection. Under my watch, the company transitioned from a simple regional freight forwarder to a major international logistics player, securing a massive $24 million annual contract with Summit Retail, one of the largest consumer electronics importers in the country. We handled their entire trans-Pacific supply chain, moving high-value components from ports in Asia straight to distribution centers across the Midwest. The secret to our seamless operation was a highly specialized setup. Under federal regulations, specifically Title 19 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 141.31, a corporation cannot file customs entries on behalf of clients unless they have a licensed customs broker supervising the operations. To keep overhead low and protect the main corporation from liability, Walter and I agreed on a unique arrangement. I founded a private entity called Vance Compliance Solutions. The parent logistics company did not own my firm. Instead, we entered into an exclusive corporate service agreement, granting my firm the power of attorney to execute all customs filings, transmit automated entries via the automated broker interface, and manage the company continuous customs bond. A continuous customs bond is a financial guarantee required by the federal government under Title 19 of the United States Code, Section 1623. It ensures that all import taxes and fees are paid to the government, even if the importer goes bankrupt or defaults. For an operation as large as ours, the federal government required a massive continuous bond backed by an underwriter, costing $250,000 annually. The underwriter would only write this bond if they had absolute confidence in the licensed customs broker managing the account. For 20 years, that broker was me, and the bond was registered under Vance Compliance Solutions, while the logistics firm operated under my regulatory umbrella, paying my private firm a monthly retainer. We performed monthly internal audits and verified the classification of every single item, ensuring that the federal inspectors never had a reason to flag our cargo. It was a clean, mutually beneficial system until the year 2024, when Walter Health began to decline. At 62, Walter was tired and wanted to step back from the daily chaos of international freight forwarding. He had spent his entire life building the business, but his doctor advised him that the stress was taking a dangerous toll on his heart. Instead of promoting a veteran manager from within the company who actually understood the shipping yards and federal codes, Walter brought in his nephew, Preston Garrison. Walter's sister had begged him for years to find a spot for her son, and Walter finally relented under family pressure. Preston was 31, possessed a brand new Master of Business Administration degree from an Ivy League school, and carried himself with the unearned confidence of someone who had never actually seen a shipping container in real life. Preston was appointed as the Vice President of Global Operations, and to him, logistics was not about physical movement, labor, or regulatory compliance. To Preston, logistics was just numbers on a spreadsheet that could be trimmed to make himself look like a financial genius. From his first week in the office, Preston made it clear that he viewed my department as a massive money pit. He would walk into the compliance office, adjusting his expensive suit, looking at the screens displaying automated customs filings, and shake his head in disapproval. He did not understand why we spent money on continuous customs bonds, why we audited every commercial invoice, or why we paid a monthly fee to Advanced Compliance Solutions. In his mind, customs compliance was just rubber-stamping paperwork, and he did not see the decades of relationship building with port directors or the legal risks of misclassifying imported goods. During our first budget review meeting, Preston pointed his finger at the line item for my private firm compliance retainer. He asked why we were paying a separate entity for compliance when we had an in-house logistics team, his voice dripping with condescension. I explained the legal framework, explaining that without my licensed broker status and my private firm customs power of attorney, the logistics company could not legally transmit automated clearance data to the federal portal. I told him that the continuous customs bond underwriter required a licensed broker with a spotless record to secure the bond. Preston laughed, waving his hand dismissively, calling it just administrative bureaucracy. He claimed we could easily hire a junior clerk for $40,000 a year to push the buttons on the customs portal and find a cheaper underwriter online to write a bond for a fraction of the cost. He told me that older guys love to make things sound complicated just to justify high salaries, and that cutting my firm contract and the audited bond renewal would save them over $200,000, which would be a direct addition to their operating margin. I looked at Walter, who was sitting at the end of the table. The boardroom was silent, with a view of the Pacific Ocean through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The old founder looked tired, his eyes fixed on the floor, unwilling to argue with his sister's son, whom he had promised to groom for the chief executive officer position. Walter did not say a word, and I knew then that the old era of Garrison Global Logistics was over. Preston was determined to cut the very foundation that kept the company standing, and his uncle was too exhausted to stop him. I took a deep breath, looked Preston straight in the eyes, and decided that, if he wanted to play with fire, I would let him hold the match. Over the 3 weeks, Preston's cost-cutting plan began to take shape, and the cracks in the company foundation started to widen. The annual renewal of our continuous customs bond was scheduled for September 15th. This was not a simple transaction, where you write a check and receive a certificate. Under federal law, specifically Title 19 of the United States Code, Section 1623, the bond underwriter required a comprehensive compliance audit of the previous 12 months of cargo manifests, checking for any classification errors or unpaid duties. Because of our clean record, the underwriter was prepared to renew our continuous bond with minimal premium increases. However, Preston had other ideas, and he called me into his office on a Tuesday afternoon. His desk was covered in glossy financial reports, and he had a smug look on his face, as he told me that $250,000 was an absurd amount of money to pay for a piece of paper. He said he had done some research and they could buy single transaction bonds for each shipment instead of paying a massive upfront premium, which would save them at least $180,000 this year. I stared at him in disbelief and asked if he had even read the operational manual. I explained that a single transaction bond is designed for small importers who bring in 2 or 3 containers a year, whereas we move over 3,000 containers a month just for Summit Retail. Under customs regulations, every single transaction bond must be manually reviewed and approved by a customs port director, taking between 5 to 10 business days to process. If we switched to single bonds, our containers would sit at the port for over a week before they could even be inspected, and the demurrage fees from the ocean carriers would be $250 per container per day, which would equal $750,000 a day in storage fees for 3,000 containers. Preston's sneered, telling me that compliance people are always terrified of change, and that he had already talked to a local freight agent who said they could clear shipments using their own bond for a fraction of the cost. I told him that was illegal under federal law, as using another company customs bond to clear commercial cargo without a registered co-principal agreement is a violation of customs regulations, known as bond routing fraud. I warned him that if Customs and Border Protection detected it, they would seize the cargo, suspend import privileges, and file criminal charges against the officers of the company, including him. I explained that the fines, penalties, and forfeitures branch would hold him personally liable. Preston's face turned red, the veins in his neck bulged, and he slammed his hand on the desk, telling me not to lecture him on the law because he had a Master of Business Administration from a top-tier school. He then informed me that my contract was officially terminated, effective immediately, and that they were bringing all customs operations in-house. He bragged that he had already hired a tech-savvy communications graduate who could easily handle the automated portal. I reminded him that the corporate service agreement required a 60-day written notice for termination and that he was in material breach. But he sneered and said their legal team would tie me up in court for years, calling my methods obsolete and stating that they did not need my expensive regulatory insurance. I stood up, adjusted my tie, and told Preston that I would need my termination notice in writing, signed by him and Walter. He told me I would get my paperwork and ordered me to pack my things and get out of the building immediately. 10 minutes later, 2 security guards stood at the door of my office while I packed my personal files, my licensed customs broker certificate, and my personal laptop into a cardboard box. My staff looked on in silence, their faces filled with anxiety because they knew that the entire compliance framework of the company resided in my head and in the secure servers owned by my private firm. As I walked out of the lobby, Preston was standing near the elevators with a group of managers, talking loudly about the overhead savings he had just secured. I walked out to the parking lot, placed my box in the trunk of my car, and sat in the driver's seat, feeling a cold professional resolve. Preston believed that customs compliance was just a bureaucratic game, but he was about to learn that in the real world of international shipping, regulations are not suggestions. I drove to a quiet local diner 3 blocks from the port, a place where cargo dispatchers and tugboat captains often gathered to escape the harbor wind. The smell of fried grease and stale coffee filled the air as I sat in a corner booth, ordered a cup of black coffee from a tired waitress, and opened my laptop. I struck up a brief conversation with a veteran driver who was complaining about the rising shipping delays, noting that any compliance mistake could ruin a trucking fleet. After he left, I connected to the secure portal of the Automated Commercial Environment System. The first step was to revoke the customs power of attorney that my firm had granted to the logistics company. Under Title 19 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 141.31, a power of attorney is a legally binding authorization, and I accessed the secure database of the National Finance Center of Customs and Border Protection to formally revoke it. I selected the corporate profile, entered my personal broker credentials, and checked the box to terminate the authorization. The moment the revocation was processed in the federal system, the logistics company importer of record number was decoupled from my license. In the eyes of the federal government, they no longer had a licensed customs broker supervising their operations. Without a supervising broker, their ability to clear commercial cargo through the automated customs pipeline was instantly suspended. The federal system automatically generated notification emails and sent them to the logistics firm corporate address. The second step was to address the continuous customs bond. I drafted a formal email to the underwriters at Beacon Surety Group, attaching the signed termination paperwork, proving that they had unilaterally severed their relationship with my firm, Vance Compliance Solutions. I wrote that my firm was immediately withdrawing its regulatory oversight and compliance endorsement from Garrison Global Logistics. The underwriters responded within 45 minutes. They thanked me for the notification and immediately transmitted a digital bond cancellation notice to the Customs Bond Branch Indianapolis, which was scheduled to take effect at midnight. The final step was the physical shutdown of the data pipeline. The logistics company internal software did not connect directly to the federal portal, but instead routed all data through a secure virtual private network tunnel that connected to the main servers of my firm, which I hosted in a secure facility. I logged into my server console, entered the command to terminate the virtual private network service, deleted their routing credentials, and changed the cryptographic encryption keys. The pipeline was cut, and their staff could type all the entry data they wanted. But the moment they hit the transmit button, the data would hit a wall. The timing could not have been worse for them. That evening, 5 major ocean carriers, including the Pacific Monarch, the Star of Shanghai, the Ocean Network Giant, the Emerald Wave, and the Northern Sea, were docking at the port of Long Beach. These massive vessels were carrying a critical shipment of consumer electronics for Summit Retail, their largest client. There were exactly 3,200 containers of high-value components, microprocessors, and lithium-ion battery packs valued at over $45 million. Under our contract with Summit Retail, the logistics firm was legally obligated to clear these containers through customs within 48 hours of docking and deliver them to the Midwest distribution hubs. If we failed, the company faced a late delivery penalty of $1,200,000 per day, and the client had the right to terminate the $24 million annual contract for cause. These high-value electronic parts were the lifeblood of Summit Retail regional factories, and any delay would disrupt their entire nationwide distribution. At 10 o'clock that night, I sat in the kitchen of my house drinking a cup of black coffee, watching the port activity tracker on my second monitor. I could see the container ships being unloaded by massive gantry cranes, and I knew that the evening shift clerks would be sitting at their desks, trying to upload the customs entry summaries, only to see their screens flash red with fatal error codes. By Monday morning at 8 o'clock, the operational failure at the logistics company was visible to the naked eye. The terminal gates at the port of Long Beach were jammed with over 100 container chassis trucks that the company had leased to transport the Summit Retail cargo. The independent truck drivers who were paid by the haul were growing increasingly furious as the hot morning sun beat down on the asphalt, creating a haze of diesel exhaust. The bottleneck quickly backed up onto the public highway, causing the Port Authority police to intervene and demand that the trucks be moved. But when the first truck approached the gate, the terminal security system flashed a yellow light, and the barrier remained down because the customs officer's screen showed a red hold flag for cargo customs detention with no valid bond on file. Within 2 hours, a massive bottleneck of semi-trucks formed along the port access roads, and the truck dispatchers began calling the office. With 100 trucks sitting idle, the company was losing $15,000 every hour in trucking penalties. Inside the headquarters, the junior clerk Preston had hired a young woman with a degree in communications and no experience in customs law, was staring at a computer screen filled with red error codes, frantically clicking the refresh button on the portal. Preston stood behind her, his expensive tie loosened, screaming and demanding to know why the entries were not clearing. The clerk looked at him terrified, explaining that the port director office said their importer of record number had been flagged because they did not have a registered customs power of attorney or a valid customs bond. Preston slammed his hand on the desk and ordered her to call the local freight agent to clear the cargo under their bond, but the agent refused over the speakerphone. The agent, a man named Wallace Jenkins, explained that they could not route 3,200 containers of high-value electronics under their customs bond, because that was a massive federal violation that would cause the government to suspend their own license and audit their entire business. Wallace explained that the fines, penalties, and forfeitures branch of Customs and Border Protection would issue fines equal to the domestic value of the merchandise for bond routing violations. Wallace told Preston that nobody in the port would touch their cargo until they got a licensed broker of record and a new continuous bond. Preston frantically called other local logistics firms, but the moment they heard about the compliance hold on the importer of record number, they hung up, refusing to risk their own operations. By Tuesday afternoon, the financial damage was mounting at an alarming rate, with demurrage fees for the 3,200 containers amounting to $800,000 per day. Dennis Lawson, the director of logistics at Summit Retail, called the office and demanded to speak directly to the founder, Walter Garrison. The call was routed to the main conference room, where Walter and Preston were sitting with the senior management team. Dennis' voice crackled over the speakerphone, filled with absolute fury, as he explained that their manufacturing plants in Ohio and Indiana were running out of components, and if those microprocessors did not clear customs, by Wednesday morning, they would shut down their assembly lines, costing their company $7 million a day. He warned them that under their agreement, the logistics firm was fully liable for all consequential damages, and if they did not resolve the customs issue in the next 12 hours, they would terminate the contract for cause and file a lawsuit for $45 million in damages. Dennis added that they had contracts with major nationwide big-box retailers, and if their shipments of consumer electronics were delayed, these retailers would charge them late fees, cancel their distribution slots, and give the inventory space to their competitors. This was not just a logistics bottleneck. It was an existential threat to their market share. Walter's hands were shaking as he looked at his nephew, who was staring at the floor in silence, his unearned arrogance completely gone. Walter knew that a $45 million lawsuit would bankrupt the company within a month, as their entire annual revenue was $65 million, and the debt on their truck fleet and warehouse leases would crush them. After the client hung up, Walter turned to Preston, his voice trembling with anger, pointing out that Preston had claimed to save $200,000 by firing me. But now they were facing a $45 million lawsuit and losing $800,000 a day in port storage fees. Walter walked out of the conference room, closed the door to his office, and dialed my personal cell phone number. I was sitting in my backyard reading a book when my phone rang, and I let it ring 4 times before I answered. Walter's voice was desperate, cracking under the pressure as he begged me to come back and fix the massive crisis. I calmly told him that I was sorry to hear about the trouble, but my contract had been terminated by his vice president of operations, and my firm no longer represented his company. Walter pleaded with me, admitting that it was Preston's mistake and promising to do whatever it took to get me back. I told him that restoring the import pipeline was no longer a simple administrative fix. I dictated my terms clearly, stating that my firm must be signed to a new 3-year exclusive service agreement. Our monthly retainer must increase from $15,000 to $30,000, and Preston must be stripped of all operational authority and banned from the building. I also demanded a one-time consulting fee of $150,000, payable immediately via wire transfer, and 12 months of my previous salary as severance for the unlawful termination that Preston had executed. Walter tried to argue that we had been business partners for 20 years, but I pointed out that his nephew had thrown that partnership away in 10 minutes while Walter sat silent. Walter's sister had also called him, screaming at him to save her son's career, but Walter realized that Preston had nearly destroyed his life work and that family loyalty could not override regulatory reality. There was a long silence on the line as Walter calculated the numbers, but compared to the millions they were losing and the $45 million lawsuit, my terms were a bargain. He agreed, and within 30 minutes, the notification from my bank popped up on my phone, showing that the wire transfer of $150,000 and my severance pay had cleared. A signed copy of the new service agreement bearing Walter's signature arrived in my email, and I sat down at my desk to go to work. I logged back into the Federal Automated Commercial Environment portal, uploaded the newly executed customs power of attorney, and reconnected their importer of record number to my firm. The federal system updated their status to active within minutes. I then contacted the bond underwriters at Beacon Surety Group, who immediately reactivated the continuous customs bond and transmitted the reinstatement code to the customs database. Finally, I accessed my private servers and restored the virtual private network tunnel, updating their routing credentials. I contacted the port directors at the Port of Long Beach to verify that the compliance hold had been lifted. The secure pipeline was open once again, and I called the logistics office to tell them they could start transmitting the entry summaries. Within seconds, my server monitors began to light up as their system started routing the data files. On my second monitor, I watched the port terminal system update, and one by one, the red hold flags on the 3,200 containers turned to green. The customs clearance codes were approved, and the trucks began moving through the gates. The independent truck drivers received the green light notifications on their mobile applications, started their diesel engines, and the massive logjam finally began to break. By Wednesday morning, all $45 million of electronic components had cleared the port, the assembly lines did not have to shut down, and the $24 million annual contract was saved. On Thursday morning, I drove to the headquarters and saw Preston walking down the hall carrying a cardboard box, escorted by the same security guards he had hired to escort me out. I stood near the reception desk and watched him walk past. He did not look at me, keeping his eyes glued to the floor. The security guards who had escorted me out with cold indifference now guided him out with a firm, professional speed. The office staff did not whisper, they simply watched in absolute silence. A silence that carried more weight than any mockery. Preston's unearned pride had crumbled, replaced by the reality that in this industry, reputation and compliance are everything. He was clutching his Ivy League diploma and a few desk toys, his face completely pale and his expensive suit looking wrinkled as the employees watched him leave with a sense of relief. Walter was waiting for me in his office, and he stood up, shook my hand, and thanked me, admitting he should have never let his nephew interfere. I set my briefcase on his desk and suggested we hire a competent general manager who understood that logistics is a physical business, not just numbers on a spreadsheet. Over the next few months, I helped him hire a veteran operations director named Howard Bentley, and the company slowly recovered from the losses of that week. Under our new contract, my firm managed the compliance pipeline with absolute authority, and they paid our increased retainer on time every month. Before I handed the keys of the business to my senior analyst, I spent my final months documenting every single contact, every tariff classification shortcut, and every historical regulatory dispute we had resolved. I wanted to ensure that the compliance standards I built would endure long after my departure. My analyst, who had worked under my supervision for a decade, was more than ready to carry the torch. I retired 3 years later, handing the operations of my firm to my senior analyst, who continues to run it today. Sometimes when I look out at the shipping lanes in the Pacific, I think about Preston. He wanted to save a small amount of money by cutting the foundation of the company, but in the end, his arrogance cost them millions and cost him his career. He learned the hard way that in the complex world of global logistics, the rules are not obstacles to be bypassed. They are the tracks that keep the train from running off the rails.